Thank you very much, Kevin. I kind of like the word partisan. I don't know, it plays to. I think I prefer the word partisan than the word trust. I think I think I very much agreed with what Brendan O'Brien said earlier. Is a focus and trust is a bit like it's protesting too much. It's a bit like saying I'm an honest person. And I think actually people now, viewers, consumers of news, actually make decisions based in a certainly more nuanced way than do I trust this outlet. It's much more about, is this outlet actually telling me something that is interesting, that is useful, that I want, and I think that's actually much more. And trust seems to me to be almost quite a patrician, maybe 19th century view as a value, which now I'm not saying it's not a useful value, but it's not one that should be the guiding principle. So what I really wanted to say, and I'm afraid I'm going to keep most of my comments to local issues, the issues in Ireland, because that's what I know, is as a starting point that a partisan media is not only, it's not just an editorial issue, it's a political issue. In Ireland, state control of television is excessive and it's anti-democratic. Consequently, here in Ireland, we've the least developed television media in Western Europe. Six of the eight television channels available to citizens for free are state-owned. The state broadcaster, RTE, owns the broadcast transmission network and limits who is on it. Advertising prices are controlled by the state broadcaster, which as the dominant entity with pricing power effectively sets the price for the industry. The state broadcaster RTE's budget for programming is about 6 times greater than its only indigenous competitor, which is ourselves in TV3. Indeed, the state's niche broadcaster, the Irish language TG Cahir, has a programming spend greater than TV3's. All of this says to me that when you talk about partisanship, you start from a point where the state has got a very excessive and dominant control in terms of what is said and what people hear and what people see. There's in last year, in 2012, the Irish Competition Authority, in a landmark decision, and it was the first ever published in an abusive dominance case, enforced RTE to abandon an ad share scheme that it deemed to be anti-competitive. It also concluded in every test of competitiveness, RTE was deemed to be acting competitively. There was no action, and there has been no action since. All of that might be a bit industry and a bit internalised, but where it's relevant to this is that decision wasn't even reported on RTE's news. And I contrast that with the recent Ryanair case, which got very heavy coverage, and perhaps that's something to do with Ryanair being a private company as opposed to a state-owned entity. A 5-year review of RT funding has just been completed by the Broadcast Authority of Ireland, which recommended a rebalancing of revenues, so that as RT gets more state funding, which I completely support the work Kevin Backhurst, who was on the panel earlier, is doing. I think he's brought a fine approach to RT's journalism. I think RT has excellent journalists, and I think those journalists deserve to have the funding so that they can provide the services that are an essential part of a public service. But the rebalancing which the Broadcast Authority recommended was that as RT gets more state funding, then it should lose some of its commercial funding so that commercial operators can operate. And that all goes back to a state aid decision which said to have plurality in broadcasting, you have to make sure that there is sufficient commercial funding available, and is a trend that you see throughout Europe. Interestingly, the government has moved to implement all of the recommendations of the Broadcast Authority of Ireland, except on rebalancing. So they've done all the recommendations that will help RTE, but nothing around the commercial sector. So that's why I say partisan media is not only an editorial issue, it's a political issue. It's also an economic issue, and if I can address this to you, Kevin, I have to ask myself sometimes, what use is plurality when nobody has the resources? And resources is by far the biggest challenge that faces journalism in Ireland, and probably the biggest challenge that faces journalism worldwide, but certainly in Ireland. The lack of resources means that a lot of this debate might largely be academic, and I think it's absolutely incumbent, I think, on journalism schools to teach economics and the economics of journalism to their students, because the biggest challenge that journalists will face is a daily challenge. Do I have the resources? How can I get the resources? Is it about getting the biggest audience? Is it about getting the biggest audience so it gets advertising? Is it about getting public funding? And those are the challenges that actually, if addressed, will allow journalism to prosper. I will talk briefly in the editorial issues. I mean, the language of broadcast regulation is almost Orwellian. Every time I hear the words like balanced or fair or objective or impartial, I think, who is it who's being defended here and why? In an open democracy, what is the need for such control? And these are the broad dangers I see around the excessive broadcast regulation which exists. The first is that the notion of balance and fairness provides a respectability that reduces the scrutiny of broadcast news, or to be honest, BBC News or RTE News. We are brought up to believe that these are objective. It's back to the old, I think it was Fox who had fair and balanced as their tagline. But we've been brought up to believe that what you see in the BBC or what you see in the RTE is somehow true, or it's to be trusted, and we come back to that word trust. And that's why I have sympathy with Brendan O'Brien's view, is actually I think we've moved on from that notion of just simply being able to trust or not trust. We can make our own judgments and balance those. A famous case here when Kevin Backhurst was talking about issues that had come up in Irish journalism was, of course, what's called Tweetgate, the presidential election debate, when that infamous false tweet caused Sean Gallagher to implode. And that was seen, and of course it became a huge controversy, and became controversy about the tweet and what was the tweet, where did it come from, why did it happen, was it fair? Whereas actually I think the deeper issue, because that can happen to any broadcaster, it can happen particularly around live broadcasting, but the bigger issue seemed to me an admittance that somehow Sean Gallagher was going to be targeted because he was the front runner, and that somehow this was fair, that you target him more in the debate because he's the front runner. And I'd question whether Michael D. Higgins, as the Labour candidate, if he were the front runner, would he have been similarly targeted? And we come back to this question, therefore, of what is the inherent or inbuilt bias that may exist. The second big danger I see is there's no effective regulation for dealing with the primary source of editorial power, which is what to publish and when. So I am regulated heavily by the Broadcast Authority of Ireland, as is RTE, but we are only regulated on what we broadcast. We're not regulated on what we don't broadcast. I mentioned the Competition Authority issue earlier, and what's interesting about this is even TV3 didn't report it, and I think, and my colleagues in Newsroom will argue with me and disagree with me in this, I think TV3 didn't report it because RTE didn't report it. So you get to this issue of the anchoring of a news story, that it is officially news once it's on a BBC or an RTE, or maybe in the past on a CNN, or maybe even in the present. One story that was very controversial for TV3 was the reporting of Brian Lenihan, the Minister for Finance, the reporting that he had cancer. and it was considered to be extremely insensitive. It was reported at Christmas time. And it is up to people to make their own judgments on that, and I would never say anything, and I've never said anything more in it, other than we had a judgment to make, and that's our job, to make that judgment. Whether we made the right or wrong judgment is up to others. And it's a very sensitive issue. But what was interesting is the outcry was against TV3 for doing this at such an insensitive time. Nobody questioned what seemed to me the obvious question, which is nobody questioned, why didn't RTE publish the story? Now, again, it could have been they didn't have the story. I think they said they did have it. And again, they may have made the right judgment. I don't say whether it was right or wrong, they didn't publish it. But what was interesting is the outcry wasn't, why didn't this get published? And that seems to me a fundamental part around the broadcast regulation. It's all about what we do, it's not about what we don't do. And by the way, I should say that Kevin Rafter's written a really excellent article for people who are interested in journalism. Is it in Journalism Studies on that whole issue? The final area, it says, broadcast regulation is one-sided and impractical. The regulation is on the broadcaster, but it's not on politicians. So we're charged with being fair and balanced and all of those, and impartial. But there's no such, considering most of our source, most of what we're covering, let's say, is politics, there's no such requirement of politicians, and it would be ridiculous if there were. But we are, in a debate, we're required to represent all sides of the debate. But if Enda Kenny doesn't turn up in our studios, we're still required to represent his views. And it means that politicians here can, by and large, pick and choose where they go, and typically they go on to RTE, and what programmes they go on to. So they go on to state television. But they don't like going on to programmes that might be a bit awkward. And that seems to me to be counter to this whole obligation that is placed on media. I just end by coming back to that issue of resources, in that I think regulation as it works in this country, it's slightly better in the UK, because I think Ofcom has slightly more joined up thinking between the editorial and economic sides of regulation. In this country, all of the regulation is editorial, none of it is economic. And that is a major gap. So, and because it comes from an editorial position, it actually works very strongly against commercial broadcasters. So I am not allowed to have news and current affairs sponsored. I don't get any of the license fee. I don't get state money. RTE gets state money, and as I say, it's quite right, it does. But that funds their news and current affairs. How am I to fund news and current affairs when it can't be sponsored? What I did was I actually changed the classification, and I called our late night current affairs show Vincent Brown. I classified it as an entertainment show. And I managed to have it sponsored for 1 year until the regulator caught up with me and said, and I asked them how they could tell it was current affairs and not entertainment. And they turned, I don't think he'll mind me just saying who it was. Bob Collins turned around to me, and almost in that kind of calling me a cheeky pup, Bob Collins turned around and he says, "Look, I know it's current affairs." So we had to take the advertising off. But the really serious issue there is, with that, we were able to take the show, and we could have taken the show to Limerick, to Cork, to Donegal. We could have got 2 more researchers in the show. We could have hired a couple more of Kevin's very fine students, and they are very fine from here. We could have done all of that. And if anybody thinks for one moment that the sponsorship that I get for Vincent Brown's show is somehow going to influence the editorial in that show, then I suggest I take that up with Vincent Brown. It is so it's a clear example of where the non-economic view of regulation, purely editorial view, is a danger. So I'm sorry, it's probably quite boring for all the journalists to be talking about the economics, but that's where I come from.
Great, thank you very much, David.